it's just such an honor for, a debut novelist like me to be doing an event with Susan, who I just sort of freaked out over the first time I met you in Miami, and whose latest book, Trust Exercise, I'm actually in the process of deconstructing, analyzing, outlining, and sort of like taking copious notes on, because there are a lot of things that I can learn for my next novel. Seriously, like I'm doing that right now, and I'm so excited to be doing this event with you. Okay, so I'll do a quick reading from the very beginning of
Oh,
my
thank
novel.
you.
Yay. So this is from the beginning of Miracle Creek, and this is the incident in Miracle Creek, Virginia, 2009. My husband asked me to lie. Not a big lie. He probably didn't even consider it a lie, and neither did I at first. It was such a small thing what he wanted. The police had just released the protesters, and while he stepped out to make sure they weren't coming back, I was to sit in his chair, cover for him, the way coworkers do as a matter of course, the way we ourselves used to at the grocery store, while I ate or he smoked. But as I took his seat, I bumped against the desk, and the certificate above it went slightly crooked as if to remind me that this wasn't a regular business, that there was a reason he'd never left me in charge before. Pak reached over me to straighten the frame, his eyes on the English lettering. Pak U, Miracle Submarine LLC, Certified Hyperbaric Technician. He said, eyes still on the certificate as if talking to it, not to me. Everything's done. The patients are sealed in. The oxygen's on. You just have to sit here. He looked at me. That's it. I looked over the controls, the unfamiliar knobs and switches for the chamber we'd painted baby blue and placed in this barn just last month. What if the patients buzz me? I said. I'll say you'll be right back, but if something goes wrong and what could go wrong? Pak said, his voice forceful like a command. I'll be right back and they won't buzz you. Nothing will happen. He walked away as if that was the end of the matter. But at the doorway, he looked back at me. Nothing will happen, he said again, softer. It sounded like a plea. As soon as the barn door banged shut, I wanted to scream that he was crazy to expect nothing to go wrong on this day of all days when so much had gone wrong. The protesters, their sabotage plan, the resulting power outage, the police. Did he think so much had already happened that nothing more could? But life doesn't work like that. Tragedies don't inoculate you against further tragedies, and misfortune doesn't get sprinkled out in fair proportions. Bad things get hurled at you in clumps and batches, unmanageable and messy. How could he not know that after everything we'd been through? Thank you. Susan, I'll turn it over to you.
I should just use my actual real hands and not just my Zoom hands. I loved hearing you read that. Oh my God. Can I just say, all right, fangirl coming back at you. When Bennett used the phrase debut author, and then when you used it, like I startled both times because I can't think of you as a debut author. I really cannot think, like this book is so, this book is not a first book. I mean, I realize it is your first book, but it just does not read like a first book. I was blown away by this book. And so the idea that you're a debut author, I'm like, damn, how did she do that?
Oh my God, thank
so
you.
Good.
Oh,
So good.
You just made my month.
Oh yeah. I mean, reading your book made my month. I loved it. Everyone should read it and block some time because you're not going to want to stop once you start. It's like that. Yeah. Anyway, we'll talk more, but,
Okay.
so I'm going to read a little bit from Trust Exercise. It's just the times they are so intense right now. For some reason, I'm moved to read something I've never read before because I'm so tired of the things I have read. So
Right.
Forgive me, everybody. And thank you for being here, all of you, for choosing to spend your hour with us. I'm going to read from the earlier part of my book, which focuses on a bunch of teenagers in a drama program at a performing arts high school. They are desperate to please their charismatic acting teacher who has been teaching them these things called repetition exercises. And the repetition exercise is two students sit facing each other, and one makes a statement and the other repeats it. And it's all about sort of subtext, emotional subtext. And so all of the students are watching their classmates, Colin and Julietta, who are kind of minor characters in the book, but I really love them, do this repetition exercise. Colin to Julietta, your hair is curly. Indisputable. Julietta's emblem is her corkscrew curl hair. Her hair stands up and sideways from her head and bounces when she walks and is an extension of her radiant smile. Julietta's cheeks are downy and pink at all times. Her eyes sparkle. Her mother is French and has bequeathed to Julietta adorably unique pronunciations like, for the common white spread, mayonnaise. Julietta's mother has also bequeathed to Julietta an ecstatic Christian faith. Unlike Pammy, Julietta never seems to feel obliged to defend her religion. When her classmates inform her God doesn't exist, she beams at them without condescension. She loves them for sharing their thoughts, just as Jesus loves them, and they don't even need to believe it. Julietta dazzles Colin now with her smile. What a perfectly right thing he said. My hair is curly. She chuckles. Colin to Julietta. Your hair is curly. Damn, girl, when you look curly up, there's your hair. Julietta to Colin. My hair is curly. Oh, is it ever, Colin? You cannot talk my hair out of curling. Isn't that funny? Colin to Julietta. Your hair is curly. Come to think of it, Colin also has thick, wavy hair. Anywhere else, Colin's hair would be curly, but here it's competing with Julietta's storybook hair, her bouncy fairy princess hair, her hair from an idealized painting of some nature maiden with springtime's own blossomy vines for her hair. Does Colin's hair, his coarse, tufty hair, even count? My hair is curly. Julietta shrugs. Big deal. Plenty of curly hair here. Your hair is curly, Colin says suddenly, his voice rough with impulse, as if the words got ahead of their sound. He stares a narrow bead at Julietta, and just like that, she flushes crimson, as if he'd unbuttoned her jeans. A disbelieving titter streaks the room. Damn, how did he do that? He's good. Colin is usually so busy playing the rude Irish thug of his ancestral imagination, they forget that he's actually good. Silence. Mr. Kingsley snaps his fingers at them, then nods sharply to Colin. Next level. Colin still leads. The next level is subjective observation. Subjective, an opinion, a feeling, a judgment, very often a confession, as opposed to ostensibly simpler objective, a statement of fact. By and large, they tend to think of the objective as describing the follower. Here, Julietta, who speaks second, responds, and the subjective as describing the leader. Here, Colin, who speaks first, makes the leading statement. But that's only because their dichotomous thinking is still undeveloped. Without a pause, Colin says, "You're a virgin." Whoa. Oh shit, cries Angie, unable to button it, as Mr. Kingsley will sometimes snap out, though he usually says it with no more than a look or a snap of his fingers. He does so now, angry snap, and they all wiggle, agonized in their chairs, some straining forward with avidity and some cringing backward with dread. I'm gonna stop there. I forgot when I chose that passage that the student who has her outburst is Angie.
It's Angie, I know. I thought maybe you could see my face on the screen because I was cracking up. I'm so glad that you read that because I feel like the humor in this novel is just so, it's not something I've read a lot of people talk about in reviews and things, but I just cracked up laughing. Like every time and I just think it's just the generosity of that is just so amazing. And so I'm so glad that you chose this part that made me, forget all about my stresses and just laugh and be able to just sit back and enjoy my wine and hear you
Woohoo!
read. It's so
Continue
great.
forgetting about your stresses. I'm so glad that I'm really grateful to you for saying that, because there is humor in the book, and it makes me really happy when people notice it. And because of all the other stuff that the book is about, there's there's I think a tendency of people to feel like they don't have permission to find it funny. So I'm really glad you did, because
Oh,
I
well,
definitely want readers to find it funny.
oh, definitely. I feel like it's just the humor in really all, I mean, and in the second section with the Karen, I mean, that's where I just like guffawed about, the sort of meaning of the name Karen, which of course has, as of late in the last month or so, taken on even more weight.
I know,
But I
it's such
think
a
it's
weird
just
thing.
so,
Yeah.
yeah, right. I know you're prescient.
My book has a
Really,
Karen in it, but I didn't know what a Karen would mean
right.
in
But
this time. Yeah.
but you called it. You really, really like I was rereading that section again. And I was like, wow, this is really very, very prescient. I almost wanted to, if I were actually posting on social media, which I'm not doing lately, just because I've been sort of staying away from social
Yeah, yeah,
media.
yeah, yeah.
But if I were, I think I would just quote that entire riff on Karen, because I think it's just so perfect.
Oh my God, I love it. Thank you.
Yeah, I love
Um,
that.
yeah, the Karen thing. I mean, it's like an example of like a weird sort of one of those accidents that happens in the writing that just turns out to have a certain effect. But the the thing that I'm like dying to talk to you about in your book is all the things that like don't seem as if they could possibly be accidental. So I don't want to spoil your book for readers who haven't read it, because they should read it. One of the things about the book that's incredible to me is the incredible complexity of your plot, and the the fact that you don't just have like multiple plots and multiple characters, but multiple versions of events that people are manipulating to deceive each other, or to try to deceive someone else. There's so many lies, and it's such a tangled tapestry. And reading it, I mean, I was really gripped, and actually like couldn't spend a lot of time thinking about the craft while I was reading it, because I just wanted to know what was going to happen. But when I was
Right.
done and I was like, what am I going to ask Angie? I mean, my first question was like, how did you keep track? Like, how did you do this? Because I feel like my writing is so disorganized and organic in a way, where I kind of just start writing and I'm like, I don't know, let's see what happens. And, Karen is a really good example of like something that I
Hmm.
didn't plan on.
Right.
Karen just kind of happened in the writing. But like, how did you write this book? You had to have planned it. You had to have like,
So I'm so glad that
yeah.
we're talking. Okay, we have to talk about the craft because I have questions to ask you as well about that. But no, I didn't really plan it. I mean, I knew what the starting point was, and I knew by the end I had like a one-page outline. And so if you look at the outline that I had after maybe 6 months of sort of free writing, but before I actually started drafting, it basically says at the end, like, we find out something about who did it and why and how. And that was the only thing that I knew, was that most of my short stories don't really have a definitive ending. And I thought, you know what, for this novel that's, like a courtroom drama, it's like a murder mystery, I probably do need to have some sort of a definitive ending. So I knew that I needed it. I had no idea who it was. And
Really? So
yeah,
you
and
yourself didn't really know who would
no,
turn out to be
I
culpable.
no, I didn't know until about a
Wow.
year into drafting into writing my first draft. And so about halfway through the book. And and so at that point I started getting inklings of who it probably was. I narrowed it down to like probably two people. And then I still had to figure out, but exactly how does that happen? And until I wrote that scene where that is discussed at towards the very end, I didn't really know.
Oh my
And
God,
so
that's
it
amazing.
well, so there's a lot in the revision process, right? That I mean,
Yeah.
revision takes so much longer. But I just found, and I had to, I was like, oh, I'm going to bring this up in my conversation with Susan, because, I've heard some of the interviews that you've given where you've talked about how in writing Trust Exercise, you didn't really think that it was going to be, a novel, because you were working on something else and you were sort of playing around. So I just found, I was trying to find this chart that I had made, and to put it up on my wall for my next novel to inspire me. And one thing that I found that I wrote, this is the very first document in the folder that I kept for Miracle Creek, called Bonbons, because my original title was Bonbons in the Blue Submarine. But the file is called This Is Not a Novel, in all caps. And it was a letter to myself where I talked about how this is not a novel. This is not a real thing. This is just my practicing, in the same way that I've heard a lot of authors talk about, they're writers. And so they've written a really terrible first novel, and then they put it away in a drawer. And then, they come back and they write something else, and they read it later, and all that kind of stuff. So this was supposed to be that sort of, my exercise, like my sort of trying to figure out what it feels like to write a book length thing. And so, and it's hilarious because it's like this 5-page letter to myself of how this is terrible. The idea is terrible. This is not going to go anywhere. I don't know anything about who set the fire. And I'm just going to write it just to like discover my writing process and what it feels like to be a novelist, And so I just thought, it's so similar in that way to what you did with Trust Exercise, which I wanted to ask you about. Like, when you're writing, and then there's that moment when you go, wait, maybe I actually do sort of, maybe this could become a real thing. Maybe this could become a real novel. Like, when did you know that?
Yeah, it's a scary moment too. Like I love this story. I can't believe this because it is really, at least for me, it's strangely helpful to be writing something that I don't take that seriously.
Right.
Right. It's very freeing because you're like, I'm just gonna explore this, and the stakes are low. No one ever needs to see it, etc.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of the mindset you always have to be in, but most of the time I have to like fake my way into it. But with Trust Exercise, it was genuine because it really wasn't the thing I was working on. I was working on this other thing that I was struggling with. And so, Trust Exercise kept accumulating in a different file on days that like the other project went so badly that I literally could not stand looking at it. And I was like, ugh, well, I guess I'll go like fool around in the Trust Exercise file, which is just for fun. And it's a great question. Like, when did it stop being, I mean, I don't want to say when did it stop being fun, but like, when did it start getting, when did it sort of seem like a book to me? And it was after Karen, actually, because, I'd been writing the material about the drama students for a while, and it was very open-ended. Originally, I'd hoped maybe it would be a short story. And then I was like, clearly not going to be a short story. So this is just open-ended stuff. And then I let it lay for like a year or more. And then one day it just kind of occurred to me. I was like, maybe there's somebody else here. And I started writing Karen's section, which is now, in the existing book, it's the middle section. And I wrote it really quickly, really, really quickly. And when that was over, I was sort of struck with that sinking feeling where I thought, oh, now I actually have these two chunks of work that are interacting with each other in some way. And it feels like they want to be a thing. And then I was like, oh no, now I've got to figure out what the thing is. And things got a lot less fun really quickly.
But what about the third section? Then when did you come up with the idea of the third section? And did that like help to like bring all of the parts together?
Yeah, but it did, but it was like tons of trial and error. Like the third section was so difficult because it was the first portion of that book that I was writing, thinking of it as a book. For the first time I was going, oh, maybe this is a book. Oh, I need to write something else. Oh no, what's it going to be? And then it was agony, and I kept trying and failing because the stakes got really high suddenly. And they had been low. And I mean, you're not gonna squirm out of answering more of my questions about your process though, because
No,
because
but
you might not have known who set the fire, but the thing which doesn't spoil it for anyone, because everybody, like, the our knowledge of the fire is at the very beginning
yeah.
of Miracle Creek. One of the things that I thought was so mind-boggling about what you accomplished is that it's a mystery, and it's a very complicated mystery, but what you really get into, I thought, with incredible sort of just painful incisiveness is the difficulty of intimacy for all of these characters. All of these characters are in intimate relationships that are dishonest in some way.
Yes.
The marriage between Young and Pack, the parent-child relationship between both of them and their daughter, the other marriage between Matt and, I mean, I could go on and on. Like, every single relationship is like full of these secrets and these, not just secrets, but lies, like actual lies that intimates are telling their partners. And one of the things that I couldn't understand was, how did you keep track of the lies and the truths? Like, all of the characters are traveling through this complicated situation on separate paths, and they all, in very incremental ways, have their individual impact on the chain of events that is so enormous. And how did you keep track of, like, not only who did what, but what they said about it, which was always different? Like all these, like yes. All of their versions of reality. I feel like, because when I learned that you used to be an attorney, I was like, oh, did that help? Like, did you have to do this in cases? Like, keep track of people's testimony when it was conflicting?
Right, sure. And I did do, and by the way, there is a huge thunderstorm going on in my area. We're outside DC. So if I do get cut off from you guys because we lose power, I'll just call back from my phone. So just as an FYI.
I hope that doesn't happen.
Yeah,
okay.
Me too. But in any case, yeah, so I think it's actually, so I was not a lawyer for that. I was a trial lawyer, but I wasn't one for very long, because what I loved about being a trial lawyer was sort of like the theatricality of the courtroom scenes. And I love
which
that
you capture so well in the book, I have to say. It's like so
much
yeah.
fun. It was really fun because I was able to sort of do all the things that I loved about being a lawyer, except that I could actually like control what the witnesses said and did, which is so not what happens in real life. So that was great. But it turns out that being actually in the courtroom is like 5% of your, like of a trial lawyer's actual day-to-day life existence. So I was just like, okay, forget that. I'm miserable. I hate every other thing about being a lawyer. So I left very quickly and I became a management consultant, which requires a lot of sort of like analyzing things in Excel spreadsheet form. And so I actually did keep a spreadsheet of
oh my God, yes.
When and what impact that would have on like what the reader would think about, like, who done it, how done it, like all of that sort of stuff. So I have this like sort of weird spreadsheet of all of these things, and I didn't really do it until I was done with the novel. But once I did have to go back and sort of do that. And I do think that it's funny because the reasons that all these characters are being so, keeping secrets and lies and things from each other is, I think, a lot based on shame. And I feel like shame is such a powerful notion in the Korean culture, especially with me being an immigrant. And I feel like that is just one of these things that is not only prevalent in the Korean culture, but also in this sort of special needs community that I'm aware of, that I'm in contact with my kids, and having done the whole crazy HBOT thing with one of my kids. So between both of those things, I felt like, yeah, everybody had a reason why they were keeping all of these secrets and lies. And it got so ridiculous that I had to sort of keep a chart and keep it up in my writing nook and things, just to make sure that I wasn't, getting confused. But one thing that I did, and this also relates back to trust exercise, so I'm like gonna send it back to you also, is that when the process that I used for my writing, and I want to know if you do anything like this, like this as well, because we've talked about how we both went to this performing arts school that's sort of like CAPA, CAPD, in trust exercise, and I was a theater major, as I believe you were as well in high school. I think it was around the same time, although I was in Michigan and you were in Texas. And one thing that's really fun is because of my theater background, when I write and when I was writing Miracle Creek, because each chapter was, devoted to one POV, and I had 7 POV characters, I would, for the month or two when I was just sort of doing the first draft of whatever chapter that I was doing, I would sort of really try to do almost like a method acting type of thing. I called it like method writing in that character. And I would sort of like, go around and walk and, take these hikes and try to really get into that character's mindset, sort of like I was preparing for an improv. And then sort of like basically improv out loud, and then run over to my typewriter and type in whatever I thought was happening and things like that. Do you use any of the theater stuff in your writing
God.
like that?
I just love that. I love that. Yes and no. I mean, so the reason I was laughing is because I've never really deliberately used any of the stuff from my theater background in my writing, not consciously, but at the same time, I do always feel like once I've figured out a character, I can kind of hear them, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
I don't know if it's like a method-y thing, but I always sort of feel like when I don't know what to do with the characters, because I can't really hear them yet. Like I can't really hear them talking in my mind.
Right.
And what was so crazy and surprising about the Karen character, who, for those who haven't read the book yet, is kind of this disruptive character who she comes in and she just disrupts. She's a disruptor.
Yes. Oh, she totally is.
But she was a disruptor for me because I literally wasn't even actively thinking about the trust exercise material. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like I said, I'd accumulated some of it, and then I was still trying to work on this other thing. And one day I was actually waiting for a friend to meet me for lunch, and I heard Karen. I heard her. She was mad. She was sort of I kind of heard this voice in my ear, and it was Karen's voice. And as soon as I tuned in and was like, oh my God, I know exactly where this character is and what they're doing. The whole Karen story, which is now the middle of the book, it just unfurled so quickly. I've never had that experience of knowing almost immediately, as soon as I could hear that voice, knowing everything she wanted, everything she was going to do to get it, all the bad things that were going to happen as a result. And so it did feel like it felt almost like this experience of acting, which when I was in my theater program in high school, acting came really, really unnaturally to me. I was so self-conscious. I was just full of dread every time the prospect, I would never do an improv. I'm way too shy or way too just worried. But but Karen was almost like this instant improv that happened to me where I was awesome. I know you. And she's not me. She's very, very different.
Right. She doesn't seem like you.
She possessed me.
Because you don't seem crazy.
Thanks. Yeah. It was funny because Karen took such possession of me that I just loved her. And after I wrote her section and people read it, people would be like, wow, she's crazy. And I was kind of hurt. I was like, oh, is she?
No, in a really good way. I actually love crazy and I love crazy people. So no, I mean that
she's very galvanizing. Yeah.
Oh, definitely. But I love that. I love that you had that experience, because I think that's so, that's the thing that you dream about, right? That you fantasize about, that one day you're going to get up and something's going to click and you're going to go and it's just going to come all together, which is so wonderful. I love that.
I know. And I have to say, I feel as a public service announcement, I should say that it's extremely rare in what we do.
Right.
That is really not what usually happens. And usually the writing is kind of a slog, and just sitting down without an idea, sitting down without knowing what's happening, and just trying to put words together. And like, I love the fact that because I always say to my students that they're never going to figure out their plot until they actually write something. I'm like, you just have to write something and then you'll fix it. But, in terms of figuring out the solution to the mystery, by writing, like you didn't plan it in advance. You had to like figure it out through the process.
You have to figure, I really firmly believe that. I really think that you have to figure it out through the process. And if you don't, I think that if it's not done in an organic way through the writing and through getting to know the characters, then I'm sure you can make it work logically and intellectually it'll come together. But I'm not sure that it would feel as satisfying in an organic way. And I'm not sure that it would feel as authentic. But you do have to have faith that it's going to come together, which I'm not sure that I really did, but it didn't really matter again, because I was like, whatever, this is practice. This is not a novel.
So when did you realize it wasn't practice? Because here's the novel. I mean, here it is, not practice. It exists.
It exists. And I think, what's really interesting about it is that I think one day when I was reading through, I have a writing group and I would give them, one chapter at a time. And maybe like after the 12th chapter or something, they were like, this is really, I think this is like the best writing that you've done. And I was like, what? This is just, I don't know anything about writing mysteries or whatever. I just didn't. But it did feel like there were parts within the chapters, within the umbrella of the story, that were sort of like these little short stories that I felt like I could polish into an actual short story and submit to literary journals or whatever. And I thought once I recognized that in more than one chapter that I was working on, then I thought, maybe there is something here.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that's what makes me proud of something that I've written, is when I recognize that, there's something in, the craft of it, like the prose or whatever it is that makes me feel like, okay, this is something that I wouldn't be embarrassed to submit. And you know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
And so I was just like, I feel like I have enough of that this isn't just me scribbling for nothing, and I can actually maybe have it come together in some way, which would be cool. Okay, so I want to ask you, this is totally unrelated to writing, but I wanted to ask you, because I think it was around the same time that we were doing drama, in our various parts. Did your acting coach ever, or your theater, person, ever tell you that because you have an Asian, or part Asian background, that wasn't really something that you should pursue?
Wow.
Because I was definitely told that, hey, I also think that it didn't hurt that I wasn't particularly talented. So I think they were sort of like, oh, let's try to give her some good reason other than you suck, as to why she shouldn't go into theater.
Wow, that's great. Like a good reason, there's too much racism in this world for you to ever make it. I don't really know if that's like the better reason. I have to say no, but the reason is because I was so not even ever on our acting coach's radar as a performer. I really was like, just, I really was like one of those students where it was like, why are you in this department? I was always backstage. I was always like, I didn't even want a part really. Like acting class was agony for me. So I was always kind of trying to escape the spotlight and make somebody's costume instead.
Hilarious.
I just didn't have ambition. I kind of accidentally, I think I had a bold moment where I auditioned for this program. And then after that, I was like, oh no, this was a terrible mistake. So I never had to be actively discouraged, but that idea does not seem strange to me at all at that time. I mean,
absolutely.
and I have to say that there were no I mean, so I'm half Russian Jewish, half Korean,
Right.
and have spent so much of my years growing up answering the "What are you?" question,
Right.
that we all love so much. So, what are you? You're like,
Yeah,
oh, thank
exactly.
you.
Know where
Not,
you're really
not
from.
what are
Yeah,
you?
exactly. Yeah.
Where are you really? Yeah, it's you never really enjoy hearing that,
No, no.
but it's interesting because I think there was this way in which um, I think was uncategorizable in the eyes of like my acting teacher as well. There was sort of a like, we don't really know what category she goes into. And
Right.
there were like no Asian American um, kids in my
No.
program.
Yeah, me
None,
too. Me too. Yeah.
none.
Yeah.
Very few Asian American kids at my performing arts school in general, but those that were there were in music.
Right.
I
Yeah.
literally cannot think of a single Asian American kid who was in the drama program at the same time as I was.
Yeah, me too. Me too. I was definitely the only one. And they were like, what can we cast you in? We certainly can't cast you in, any of our period, like British period type pieces.
Yeah,
I
no,
mean,
no, we
because
couldn't possibly put you
no,
in any
no,
of those. We couldn't
no,
possibly put you in Shakespeare. That won't
no,
work.
of course
Yeah,
not.
no. And I mean, even today, it's like it hasn't changed much, you
No,
know, for
no,
for Asian American performers or a lot
no.
of performers of color. But I feel like it's a particularly interesting issue with Asian American performers that they're still being told like, sorry, no roles,
Yeah,
you know.
and it's not that there's racism at play because what can
Oh,
they do?
of course not.
That's
No,
just the material that
it's
we
just
have
the
to work with, and
yep.
so what can we do about that? Like we can't. We want verisimilitude. So we want authenticity. We need to the play calls for the all blonde, blue-eyed people, and that's all we have to cast. So what can we
Yeah,
do? Yeah,
yeah.
no, so
Got to do
important.
it. Got to
But
do
I
it.
do think that this connection between theater and writing as a craft, like it's I mean it's all over your novel. So it's interesting because of the trust exercise, like the exercises that the theater students do. To me, the trust exercise that you have built between, and I was actually trying to figure out whether it's between you, Susan Choi, the author, and the reader, or whether it's more the POV narrators, like Sarah, David, when they're, in part one, or Karen certainly in part two, and us. So I'm not sure if that's important, whether the trust exercise is between the reader and Susan Choi, or but between us and the narrators.
Right.
But regardless,
Or
it's
all
that
of the above, maybe.
right. Yeah, I think there are different levels, right? And I think it's that storytelling as sort of and the theater acting and the exercises that go on are they're all forms of storytelling in some way, and in building this hopefully what you think of as emotionally honest, if not really real. And so I thought that was so interesting that through just structure alone and what you did in parts 1, 2, and 3, that you were able to sort of make that so clear to us as the readers, which I just
Oh,
love that.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad that you say that. I mean, that's obviously that's what I was trying to do and what you do so well also. And I do think like I never thought of my writing and like my long ago experience in theater as being linked, but they really are because of like emotional authenticity,
Yeah.
and what you're talking about in terms of like figuring out your story from there, from like what's emotionally authentic to these characters, not like what has to happen.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And the fact that if you really believe it yourself, the audience can tell and the reader can tell.
Yeah, I think
Like
that's
just
very
just
true.
like we were talking about. Yeah. Like
I think
you
that's
think
very
that it
true.
shouldn't, you're just like, no, like an actor just acts, and the expressions that they use for their face or whatever, it is the same, but it's not. And we've seen
Yeah.
it over and over again, that like whether they really like feel it and know their characters or not, like that actually ends up showing up in some ineffable way that like we can't even describe, but it's really does matter. And I feel like it's the same way for writing too.
It is. It
Yeah.
is. Yeah, you have to inhabit the authentic reality of what you're writing about. And if you
Right.
don't, the writing doesn't work.
Right.
Yeah. And again, you can't put your finger on it, but it just doesn't work.
Right. I don't know what it is exactly.
Bennett's back. Hi, Bennett.
Hi, Bennett.
Hi. I've been
We're
like,
just talking.
We're just
yeah,
going
this
on
has
and
been
on. We're
phenomenal.
like,
Angie, you asked the question just now that I've had for a while, so thank you.
yeah.
Great. Yeah, I've been
Oh,
wondering
good.
about the title and the dynamics of that, and so thank you for doing that.
Isn't that great? I just
of.
love it so much.
I know.
I really, I think it's like, did you mean to do that, Susan?
You mean the title having all of these different
Yeah, to basically
No.
have there be this
Yeah.
connection
No.
between the trust exercises that you were doing in part one and really sort of what you're saying about perception and storytelling and all of those things in, and building your narrative and all of those things in parts 2 and 3.
No, it all evolved in that weird organic way. Like the file, like your file was called This
Yeah.
Is Not a Novel. My file
Yeah.
was called Trust Exercise from the very beginning. And it was just going to be a short story, and it wasn't like going to dig into all these issues. And I just called it Trust Exercise because that's what they're called
Yeah.
in acting class.
Absolutely.
That's just what they're called. And I was like, yeah, it's just a story about kids in acting class. And then it just took on all this additional,
It's so
baggage,
Yeah.
to my surprise, just
Yeah.
that's kind of the way, if the writing's going well, it just starts accumulating all this additional meaning if we're
Yeah.
lucky,
yeah. And
That's
the
what we
abuse
hope.
of trust and oh god, yeah. So
We've
so amazing.
we've had a few questions come in, and I'd like to start kind of throwing them out there for you two
Yeah.
to. And the first one that we had come in was from R. Casey, and this one is for Susan, and it says, several of your novels explore the dynamics of the teacher-student relationship being both pedagogical and simultaneously sexualized. Would you comment maybe on the intersection of these two emotional realities, especially from the perspective of the student?
Yeah, the pedagogy and the sort of sexual, the potential for sexual or romantic involvement. Yeah, I mean, I think obviously this is something that is really of kind of concern and fascination to me, because I think the relationship between a teacher and a student can be really intimate, and that intimacy can be really confusing. I think that one of the things that's fascinated me about teachers and students is that there are all these kind of conflicting emotional realities. Like a teacher has more power than a student. That is always true, right? That is just the way it is, and yet at the same time, I think because in some contexts, especially like in this theater program context where teachers and students are also can also think of themselves as being colleagues, or they can think of themselves as being mutually impassioned about an art form. They can think of themselves as being kind of comrades or cohorts in a certain way that blinds them to the power disparity between them. And I think, that's one of the things that I was interested in Trust Exercise, was the idea that the teacher in that situation, on the one hand, he really dignifies his students with a taking of them seriously. He takes them very, very seriously, and that's something they really crave as teenagers. They want to be taken seriously as people and as artists, but it's a very precarious interaction to get into, right? Because if teachers start taking their students very, very seriously, they might make the mistake of treating them as equals and peers. They might make the mistake of forgetting about the power that they have over them. They might cross a line, right? And meanwhile, I think from the student's perspective, to the question, I think students, especially if they're younger and less experienced, it can be very dazzling, right? To have an older, more powerful person reach across that divide to you and offer you this kind of false equality. That might lead you to think like, oh, maybe this is a great idea to become entangled with this person, and it's actually an exploitative situation. So I just think like that pedagogical relationship is so fraught for all of those reasons and more, but I don't want to take up all of our time. But thank you for the question. obviously I have a lot to say.
Yeah, thank you for that response, Susan.
Yeah,
We have another question from Miriam, and this is for both Angie and Susan, and it states, Miracle Creek and Trust Exercise are my book club's August and September choices.
Thank
Ooh,
you.
yay.
Thank you
Yeah,
so
he has
much.
great taste. What would each of you hope book clubs will focus on when discussing your novels?
Angie, do you want to start?
There's so many things that I think I've done like over 100 book club virtual, events or something like that. And I think it's and one thing that I hear a lot, and that I wanted to actually bring up in this conversation is there are a lot of complaints that book clubs have about a Me Too thing that happens in a sexual assault that happens in Miracle Creek, and there is not the level of punishment and justice that the older man, gets as a result of that. And one thing that is always really fun for me to discuss with book clubs, and I wanted to bring this up because I wonder if you've talked to your readers about this, Susan, is just this idea that a lot of readers, I think, tend to conflate the author and the author's views on something with the characters and what happens in the novel, and as like sort of like, oh, if this happens in the novel at the end, and so that means that the author thinks that that should have happened or whatever. And so I think that's always a really, really fun thing to discuss with book clubs for me, because then when I sort of say, well, actually, wanted the I hoped that one of the things that people would get out of this is how upset they are that there wasn't that kind of result in the criminal justice system, and to sort of ask yourselves why that might be, and why that might be the realistic thing, frankly, that's going to happen certainly 10 years ago when the book was set, and even today. And so I just think that that's a fascinating thing. And the way that people do sort of like, attribute to the author things that are stated by the narrators, and that sort of, way of conflating the two, the author versus, narrator versus protagonist. Sometimes there can even be a difference, right, between the narrator and the protagonist. So yeah, so we'd love to hear what you think about that, Susan, too.
Yeah, I'm just like nodding. Yeah, because it's so complicated. I mean, I think when we represent difficult situations in fiction, we're not endorsing that situation, right? We're representing a reality, and it's often not the reality that people want. And that's like one of the jobs of fiction, I think, just as you're saying, is to represent a difficult and maybe displeasing reality, or difficult, displeasing person. And not as an endorsement, like we're not saying like this person should be the president, or this situation is the right situation, but we're saying like this is the thing that happens. And I completely agree with you that I think what's really interesting for book clubs to explore is if they have those negative reactions to an event in the book, talk about that. I mean, like this is a moment, I think, in our, and now I have to say my neighbors are chanting, and I'm usually shouting with them, but I'm so happy that they're there. It's a little distracting. Sorry. This is a difficult, right? Like my neighbors are chanting, no justice, no peace. We have a lot of reasons to be upset and uncomfortable, and to think about things right now. And I think in fiction, when fiction makes you uncomfortable, I think that's very, very useful. And it's really productive to talk about like, why am I reacting this way? What is it? What's challenging me in this story? Like, that's what our literature's for. It's not just to reassure us and tell us what we already want to hear. And
I think especially with endings, because I do think that there is this tendency to sort of want a nice ending, a hopeful ending, an ending that makes you feel like, okay, well, that bad thing happened, but like, you know, it's fiction, so the author's going to make it okay, and then I'm going to walk away feeling okay about the world. But sometimes the point of stories is to really propel us to action, or to anger, or to, you know, want to actually get up off our asses and just do something, you know. So
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
do think that that's really so it's interesting, because that's one of the things that I like to sort of talk about, as well as unlikable characters. That's the other thing that I love, when everybody's like, well, I didn't really have a favorite character, because they were all so unlikable. And I love talking about that, because
Yeah.
I sort of love talking about the fact that, you know, like if you went around and told everybody exactly what your innermost thoughts were, the shameful thoughts that you bat away as soon as you have them, and you were forced to put that on paper and tell it to everybody, then probably people wouldn't think you're too likable either, which is, you know, a fun way to sort of challenge people to sort of think about the likability of characters, for whatever that's
Right.
worth, you know?
Right. Yeah. And also the ways in which we pass judgment on each other. I mean, I
Yeah.
think that's one of the things that Miracle Creek really, really brilliantly kind of dissects is the ways we pass judgment. And you make the reader, you lead the reader through all of these different layers of passing judgment. And then we realize, like, oh no, I've misjudged this person. I've misjudged them again. You know,
Right.
it's really, it's so interesting. Is there another question, Bennett, for
We
either of us?
do. We've actually got two that I'd kind of like to put together into one for both of you. And
Sure.
Patricia asked a question actually during your conversation, and then she followed up saying, "They're talking about my question right now, haha."
Oh, okay.
But I'll kind of mention that just right now for you really quickly, in case you maybe want to talk about it as you react to these other two questions. But she's interested in kind of how, I'm just trying to find it here in the chat. She's interested in how do you
Uh-oh.
combine them into a novel. You have an entire novel outlined before launching into the overall writing. For our question of tonight is, Maya's wondering, since you both have this background in acting and drama, if you would ever consider writing drama or plays at some point.
Susan, you go first.
Okay, I can answer Maya's question. Bennett, I'm afraid you were freezing for me when you were
Yeah, me
stating
too. Me
Patricia's
too.
question. But
Yeah,
Maya's question I can answer quickly, which is to say
Sure.
that I would really, really love to write a play, and I have no idea how. But it is like it's high on my list of things that I would like to challenge myself to do, but I haven't yet managed to figure out how to do that.
Yeah, and for me, I definitely would. I think I have like a little bit of, I don't know if it's ADHD, or I just, you know, I just get bored easily. I don't know what it is, but this writing is now my fifth career, so I just keep on going from like thing to thing to thing. I do love fiction writing so much, and I do say that I feel like fiction writing is the thing that I've been bopping around like careers and jobs, trying to like find that thing that I love, that brings me pleasure, and also satisfaction and pride, like, which are, I think, are two different things. But it's really been hard for me to find that, and I do think that fiction writing is like that. But I am thinking that possibly one of these days I'm gonna have that itch again to like do something completely different, and that would be an amazing thing to try to do. Yeah, so that would be fun.
Do you think you can restate Patricia's question?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to sneak it in here before we hop off this meeting. Patricia's wondering, do you write chapters or ideas individually and combine them into a novel? Or do you have the entire novel outlined before you launch into your overall writing process?
Oh, great. Easy question for me to answer. Never have it outlined, ever. Never have any idea what's going to happen. Stumble forward in the dark, all,
Yeah.
groping my way.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. As I've said, like, I didn't outline, I didn't know, and I just had to sort of figure out that it would hopefully be there at some point, when, and I'm writing a novel right now about a person who's missing, and a character that I really like from a short story that I really, really love. And And I'm sort of like, I don't know what happened to this person who's missing. I hope he's not dead, but I don't know. I don't know if we'll even find out by the end of the novel. So I think it's one of those things that you really, for me anyway, you have to just sort of go from scene to scene and chapter to chapter and trust that you will get there at some point. But really, for me, I have to focus on just the scene that I'm working on right now.
Yep.
Thank you
I love
both.
that we can hear. I love that we can hear the chants in your.
Can you hear them?
Susan?
Yeah,
I
that's
totally
awesome.
get them. So great. I love it.
So this is my neighbor Piper, who's 15, and she is leading the whole block. This was started by another neighbor of ours, as I mentioned, when New York went under curfew and we weren't allowed to march at night. So we just stood on our street and yelled, and we've kept it up. So I love it.
Okay, but since we were talking about like endings and outlines and stuff, let me ask Susan one more question that's
Go for it,
related
Angie.
to that. Okay. So on section 3, I'm not going to spoil it. I'm not going to like ask my specific question. However, I just have to know, in your mind, like as a reader of your own work, do you sort of have an answer to like who the people are who are in section 3 and how they correlate or don't to the characters who are in sections 1 and 2? Do you know
Yes.
do you know what I'm saying? Okay.
Yes. Yes, I do.
You do.
Yes.
Have you told any people this? Like if I called you up privately, would you tell me?
Of course.
Okay, good. Yay, that's all I needed to know. Okay.
I would tell you anything, Angie.
Okay, cool. Awesome. I love it.
Well, thank you both so much for taking some time out to stop by and read and chat together and answer our readers' questions as well. It was such a pleasure hosting you too.
Oh, it was so fun. Thank you for hosting us.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Thank
Angie.
you so much. That was so wonderful. I love it.
It was really fun to see you, although, we're not in Miami and can't actually have a cocktail.
I know.
But
I know.
second best.
And also, did you see that I posted on Instagram stories? Here. I posted this. This is the first time that I saw you. And I went to like your reading was at the National Book Festival last year, and we like passed by each other as we were both doing like the portrait session by the Washington Post.
Yeah.
Here, can you guys see me? This is Susan. Isn't that
Oh my
gorgeous?
God.
Isn't that beautiful?
That's Jesse Dittmar who did that.
Jesse Dittmar.
He took portraits of us.
This is mine.
I can't see yours. Oh,
It's like,
that's
anyway.
Great. Yeah, he's a really interesting
cool.
photographer.
So wonderful. I love that whole series. But anyway, all right. So leave you with that.
I love it. That's a
Okay.
great note to end on.
Cool.
Thank
Well,
you
I'm
both
glad
so
you made
much.
it through the thunder shower, and
No. I didn't even get. We didn't lose power. Yay! And
Yay.
and I'm glad that we were able to hear you over the chants too. And it was nice to have that as a backdrop.
I'm glad you're able to hear both.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you,
Huge.
Bennett.
Yeah, thank you to both of you for stopping by, and a huge thank you to all of our attendees tonight for joining.
Yes.
A big thank you for your questions. Somebody asked Miriam, actually questioned through the chat, if we'll be recording this. We will be. We'll be posting it. So if
Okay.
you're in need of a good book club read throughout the summer, if you maybe want to have a paperback to share with your fellow readers, think of picking up Miracle Creek or Trust Exercise. We have both available, and you'll also maybe be able to pull up this conversation as a reference to share with your book lovers. So thank you all so much. Hopefully we'll see you again soon. And everybody stay safe and have a good evening. All right, bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Angie. Support
Thank you,
Literati.
Susan.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thanks, Bennett.